Hi folks, Adam Andrews here from CenterForLit with another small contribution to a great conversation. Today's question, what is a literary education? Well, it starts with an important distinction about a horse. Everyone would agree that a horse can be thirsty, but can he be self-consciously thirsty? Can he think to himself, I am a thirsty horse? Well, that's a different question. All creatures have urges. Some creatures even have thoughts, but only humans can think of themselves as creatures with thoughts. If education is helping students become fully human, then education happens when a student catches a glimpse of himself as a thinking creature. In the best-case scenario, this glimmer of self-knowledge leads him further to understand himself as an imperfect creature, a sinful creature, desperately in need of grace. At CenterForLit, we believe that any experience, academic or otherwise, which creates the conditions for this type of self-knowledge is a worthwhile education, and that all the book learning in the world is useless if it doesn't create these conditions. It turns out, however, that the great books of the Western tradition have been creating the conditions for self-knowledge in all types of readers for thousands of years. They are tried and true, the most reliable educational tools our civilization has ever produced. A literary education, then, is simply a journey into self-knowledge using the occasions afforded by the great books. Let me give you an example, followed by 5 important questions. Have you ever read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens? The first chapter of this classic deserves its reputation as one of the great openers in literature. The tiny orphan, Pip, stands at the graveside of his parents, quietly mourning his lonely estate. Suddenly, a fearsome convict, lately escaped from a nearby prison ship, accosts him from the surrounding mists and demands food on pain of death. Pip's terror in this moment is every bit as palpable as was his grief a moment before. He hurries back to the smithy where he makes his home and, oppressed by unspeakable terror and guilt, steals food from his sister and her mild-mannered husband, Joe Gargery. It's amazing how completely Pip earns our pity in these first scenes. In addition to his extreme youth, loneliness, and abject terror, we find that his sister treats him harshly, offering a poor replacement for a mother's love. As little more than a baby and beset by all manner of disadvantages, he certainly commands our sympathy. Strangely, however, as Pip grows up and begins to master these disadvantages, our pity only grows. In fact, when he learns of his great expectations, the promise of a vast fortune bequeathed to him by a mysterious benefactor, we sense a cruel joke about to be played. Despite his immaturity and foolishness, we want Pip to get what he needs, but we can already tell that an inheritance will not do the trick. I think our sympathy has its roots in Pip's thirst for approval, which peeks out at us from the story's first pages. The contrast between Joe Gargery's doting attention and his wife's irritated neglect underscores just how much Pip depends on affirmation. And we love Joe because he provides a reliable supply. I've never met a reader with an ambivalent attitude toward Joe. We love him intensely, I think because we share Pip's desperate need ourselves. As we read this story with understanding, we begin to see ourselves more clearly. Strangely, this childlike thirst for affirmation follows Pip into young adulthood, and indeed never leaves him. His relationship with the rich eccentric Miss Havisham and her cruel young ward Estella presents a series of disappointments on this very issue. Pip looks to both of them for a word of approval, but this alone they will never grant. The lack of it drives Pip to all sorts of folly. Even Pip's great expectations loom in his mind with the power to save, not primarily because of the hope of financial security, but rather the hope of approval from society. To be a gentleman in the eyes of the world is Pip's obsession. He doesn't want to be rich for the sake of riches. He wants the affirmation that they're supposed to bring. As the story's dramatic climax proves, however, riches do not satisfy like he assumed they would. In fact, they bring as much trouble as his former poverty ever did. In putting his hope in his circumstances, Pip makes a common, even a universal error. He applies a physical solution to a spiritual problem. He looks for ease in his affairs because he hopes that they will make him easy in his soul. But his soul doesn't know riches from poverty, ease from difficulty. It longs on a deeper level for more basic needs. The soul lives or dies by the words, "I affirm you." It listens for these words alone, and every human interaction either affirms or withholds them. Pip's soul hears them from two unlikely sources in Great Expectations: Joe Gargery the blacksmith and Magwitch the convict, two of the least genteel of all the story's characters. The admittedly moralistic theme of the novel could not be clearer or more compelling. We are all orphaned waifs, lost and alone, and utterly dependent for survival on a dispensation of grace, not financial or even physical, but spiritual. A word to our souls of acceptance, approval, and affirmation. If we could find this, receive it, and possess it truly, neither plenty nor want in any other area would matter in the least. It's a beautiful theme, and Great Expectations deserves its place in the Hall of Fame of Western literature. But it's also important to see the novel in its context, as a single moment in an ongoing conversation about universal ideas and essential questions. What are the conditions for human flourishing on this earth? What does it take to really satisfy us? How important are the material things of this world? How badly do we need them? What do we really need instead? What kind of creatures are we, essentially? In Great Expectations, Dickens takes up these questions and offers his best guess at the answers. But importantly, he knows that he isn't the first to ask them, and that his answers may differ from those who have considered the questions before. He's involved, in other words, in a conversation with the artists in his tradition who have preceded him, from Job and Homer to Dante and Shakespeare to Milton and Austen and Thackeray. A literary education involves the ability to hear Dickens as a conversationalist in this sense, and to correctly locate his contribution in the landscape of the conversation that preceded it, as well as the conversation that has followed it. A student who can see Dickens responding to previous ruminations on the subject of spiritual need and acceptance does well, as does the student who understands the reactions and responses of subsequent artists to Dickens' work. Such a student can take the scope of the entire conversation about these themes and so prepare himself to make his own contributions when the time is right. But Great Expectations is only one example. A single novel that takes up a limited number of themes, makes a limited number of statements, asks a limited number of questions. Every other work of art, literary, visual, oral, or otherwise, in our cultural tradition does the same. And this brings up an important point for parents and teachers planning a literary education for their students. Our civilization has been producing great books for 3,000 years. No student will ever read them all. Luckily, a literary education, by our definition, doesn't require this. Remember, education is not a curriculum. It's a moment of self-realization. It can happen on book number 50, or on book number 1, or outside the classroom altogether. If God is faithful, it will happen over and over again to all of us. At CenterForLit, we help teachers use the great books, one at a time, as discrete opportunities to confront students with their own humanity and help them see themselves more clearly as creatures in need of grace. You can plan a literary education of your own by keeping these 5 questions and their answers in mind. Question 1. Which great books should you read? Answer: the ones that interest you. If the ancients are your bag, go ahead. Homer and Virgil are rightly praised. If you prefer Shakespeare to Seneca, however, lean into it. Do you like Dickens better than Dante? Austen better than Aristophanes? Be yourself. If it's true that you'll never read them all, and that a profound education can happen with any one of them, what's the big deal? Classic literature comes in all shapes and sizes. Shop around. You may find that reading what tickles your fancy will, over time, develop in you a taste for classic books that eventually makes the ancients more appealing. If that happens, you'll be glad, trust me. Meanwhile, read what you like. Question 2. How many great books should you read? Answer: the next one. We parents and teachers spend too much time counting books instead of reading them. Education is not a book list, it's a conversation. Question 3. How fast should you read them? Answer: as slowly as necessary. There are no deadlines in real education. Question 4. What should you do with them after reading? Answer: discuss them with another reader. The best hope of any artist is that his work will be the subject of enlightened conversation. You might say this is the intended purpose of art. If you're doing this, you're doing it right. Next question, how will you know when you're finished? You will never be finished until, as the Apostle Paul said, you know fully, even as you are fully known. Well, I hope these comments will provoke you into conversation. Meanwhile, like and subscribe for more. And if you're interested in joining the conversation at Center for Lit, click the link in the description below. Until next time, happy reading, everyone.